Morning, everyone. Good to see you and welcome back to panel 3 in dialogue with Abrahamic Traditions. This panel will be moderated by Rabbi Dr. Rose. His dialogue partners include Ms. Nana Firman and Dr. David Cloutier, and of course, Dr. Tyson Yunkaporta, or as we've learned to say, just Tyson. Or Ty. So thank you all for being here with us today. Rabbi Rose is the founding director of the Miller Center for Interreligious Learning and Leadership at Hebrew College. Before assuming this position in 2016, he worked in various administrative and teaching capacities at Hebrew College for over a decade, including serving as a founding faculty member and associate dean of the Rabbinical School. Rabbi Rose was also one of the creators of CIRCLE, which stands for the Center for Interreligious and Community Leadership Education, co-sponsored by Hebrew College and Andover Newton Theological Seminary, our school. A few months ago, Rabbi Rose invited me to participate in the Building Interfaith Leadership Initiative, which is in partnership with Interfaith America. And I have come to appreciate his passion for interreligious engagement, along with his passion for teaching and his passion for learning. But mostly, I appreciate his friendship and his love for people. Next, I'm pleased to introduce Ms. Nana Firman. Did I say it correctly?
Yes.
Earlier, I was saying Firman, but Firman. Ms. Firman is the co-founder of the Global Muslim Climate Network in Riverside, California. Nana's native country is Indonesia, and in the wake of the 2004 earthquake and tsunami, she directed the green recovery efforts and later developed a sustainable city initiative as part of urban climate change adaptation and mitigation. In 2015, she was named as the White House Champion of Change for Climate Faith Leaders. She is a LEAD Fellow, and LEAD stands for Leadership on Environment and Development. She is a LEAD Fellow on Green Economy and currently is the Muslim Outreach Director for Green Faith, a global faith and spiritual environmental action network. Nana, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you.
It is also my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. David Cloutier. Dr. Cloutier is an associate professor of theology at the Catholic University of America. His life's work delves deeply into our moral choices and the impact that they have on society. Not surprisingly, his stance on how we should live in God's world is sometimes countercultural. His award-winning book, The Vice of Luxury, recognized by the Association of American Publishers as the best in its field of scholarly thought, integrates economics, social justice, and theology. Cloutier's message calls for change in our economic and social practices. Rabbi Rose, Ms. Nana Firman, and Dr. David Cloutier are people of faith. People of faith who have a great love for God and a love for neighbor. Out of this love comes an abundant thirst, a thirst to cultivate just peace and foster integral human development. Dear friends, thank you for being with us. Thank you for yarning with Tyson. Rabbi, please lead us into this conversation.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Let me try that again. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Thank you. It is an honor and a pleasure to be here with all of you. I want to thank our hosts and our award recipient. And I also want to thank in advance my fellow panelists for their contributions this morning. Before we begin, I was asked if I might say a prayer. And rather than doing so through words, I brought with me this small shofar, a ram's horn. And as some of you, I'm sure, know, this is the high holiday season in the Jewish calendar. I will board my plane back to Boston, find some clean clothing, take my machzor, my prayer book in hand, and return to my prayer community for Yom Kippur tomorrow night. So as part of the process of what we call tshuva, turning and returning and turning again to our deepest selves, to others, to the divine, to the earth, we try and awaken or arouse ourselves in others. And I'll speak about this in my presentation through the use of this ancient instrument. And so I'm just going to sound it. And I don't want to comment further on it, but allow the breath and the sound simply to reverberate as it needs to for each of us. Thank you. Since this is Notre Dame, you're familiar with football terminology. So Charles and I decided to call an audible. Rather than have each of us speak seriatim and then see if we can still manage to have conversation, we're going to have one speaker and then some conversation, a second speaker and some conversation, a third speaker and some conversation. Since we're batting cleanup to mix metaphors, hopefully that will help us engage dynamically at this late hour. So with that, Nana.
Thank you, Rabbi. So everyone, I greet you first with the Islamic peace of greetings. Assalamualaikum. Thank you so much for the Ansari Institute for inviting me to this amazing symposium. And thank you, Tyson, for writing Sand Talk. Just please note that I'm not representing like 1.8 billion Muslims views. So, as mentioned, I work for Greenpeace, which is a global interfaith network for environment and climate action. And I live in Riverside, California, which is a traditional land of Cahuilla tribe, and originally from Indonesia. So I was born in Jambi, the eastern part of Sumatra Island in Indonesia, the home to rainforests, temple ruins, and endangered Sumatra tigers. And I consider myself a daughter of the rainforest. When I was growing up, my uncles gave me a nickname, Anak Kubu, which means a jungle kid, a jungle child. So, but both of my parents are from Minangkabau culture of West Sumatra, the home of a matrilineal matriarchal society that still exists today with a strong Islamic tradition. So it's very interesting. Although Islam may be known with its tendency to favor the male lineage, in the Minangkabau peoples, the ownership of family properties like their homes, their rice fields, or other passed from mother to daughters for generations. And that tradition of indigenous to the highlands of West Sumatra, the Minangkabau ethnic group, is considered the world's largest matrilineal society. So, but although I was born in the jungle, when I was still a baby, my parents moved to the capital city of Indonesia, to Jakarta, where I was raised and grew up until high school. And then I continued my higher education in the United States. But I spent like most of my childhood in the during the holiday to visit my grandparents in the village in West Sumatra, surrounded by lush green rice fields, volcanic mountains, and waterfalls. And when I was 8 years old, my parents took me and my sister going down a dirt road for about 500, more than 500 kilometers from Jambi, where I was born, to Bukit Tinggi, which is in the western part of Sumatra, to visit my grandparents. And on that trip, I saw monkeys jumping around from trees to trees. And my mom is an orchid lover. So on that trip, I remember I saw all those orchids hanging from the tree. So I told my mom, Mom, you can just take one of those orchids, for free. What, without knowing as a kid that you're not supposed to disturb the forest, as you wish. And I always remember that magical moment in my first time exposed to the rainforest. And back then I thought I was in heaven. So when Dr. Mahan called me and told me about the book and asked me to join the panel, I jumped right in, and without knowing what I had to do. But I just love the ideas of indigenous perspective in a way perhaps I do to try to explore my own indigenous path. As I read Sandtalk, I had to pause from time to time to process what Tyson was trying to convey. Although I felt as if he was talking in front of me, I still need to pause. I've been involved in the environmental movement for almost 2 decades now. And for half of that time, I've been also involved in the climate issues. In the beginning, like everyone else educated in the West, I used words such as environmental protection, conservation, sustainability as my mantra. However, I was faced with reality. When I had to work with the communities in Aceh, in the northern tip of Sumatra Island, after the huge earthquake and tsunami at the end of 2004, as being mentioned by Dr. Charles. So I became very frustrated at that time because I had to work with the local communities. But the local community rejected me as if I was speaking foreign language to them. In the midst of my frustration, a friend suggested me to use Islamic teachings to convey the message to the local communities, who are mostly devout Muslims. Until then, I took everything for granted. I was born and raised as a Muslim, yet I had never explored the environmental messages in Islam. Yet because of that conditions, it forced me to look back to the divine scripture, the Quran, and then the Sunnah, the teaching and living example of Prophet Muhammad, with a different lens. And to my surprise, I found too many of them. I was so overwhelmed. And one particular thing that we had to do at that time was to rehabilitate the damage in the coastal area by planting mangroves. And it's supposed to be done with the local community. And the local community is just not interested to plant anything because they had lost everything. They lost all their family members. They lost their homes. They lost their livelihoods and so on and so forth. They're devastated. And here I was. And there I was asking them, let's plant mangroves. So I was so insensitive. But then I found this hadith, the saying of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, which hadith is actually originally also oral traditions. The oral tradition are found and recorded in the Hadith literature in Islam. And this material consists of many collections of anecdotes, reports, statements, and prescription of variety of subjects, all containing the records of words and deeds attributed to Prophet Muhammad, to his companions, and to other Muslims in the early period of Islam. So it is a common knowledge that in this literature we have to do with material that is originally transmitted orally. So like, because Tyson also taught a lot of like oral traditions, and this, like the transmission with all different levels of like transmission, like it's called sana. So here goes the hadith that I use to convey the message to the community. I think also I was told like there's also like the similar thing in the Jewish tradition. So it goes like this. Even if the end of times is upon you and you have a seedling in your hand, you must plant it. This message contains a sense of hope. So I convey this message to the community. And to my surprise, remember, they rejected me before. To my surprise, their reaction changed immediately. What just happened to them, or the earthquake, tsunami, lost everything, was felt as the end of time for them. But then, I brought in this all mangrove seedlings, so they must finish the planting of those mangrove seedlings. And in the process of planting, I didn't know this before, but in the process of planting, actually, they were also experiencing the healing of themselves from the trauma that they just faced. So this is another proof that healing power of nature connection. And ever since that encounter, I've been exploring environmental movement, messages, climate issues from a faith perspective, in particular from Islam. And later I was told also that almost like 85% of the world population is considered themselves as people of faith or people of spirituality. Yet somehow we didn't really engage any environmental crisis, environmental issue, climate, like climate devastation from any faith perspective. But it has been changed in the last 10 years. And Sand Talk is about looking at the global cultures and systems from an indigenous way of thinking that offers a framework for the understandings needed in the co-creation of sustainable systems. Tyson believes that indigenous way of thinking could make the Western culture and society more sustainable in the long term. And he argues for dialogue and hybridization between our ways of thinking that could offer the sustainability itself. And I feel that ideas are not so far-fetched from our Islamic values and traditions. Although sometimes these values and tradition have been overtaken by modernity and many complex situations, which the effects of that like affecting also our culture and knowledge that have led to a lack of relationships, time, respect, and effort. And Tyson describes the main difference between indigenous and non-indigenous thinking as context. Indigenous thought is highly contextualized and situated in a dynamic relationship with people and landscape, considering many variables at once, while the non-indigenous thinking is good at examining things intensively in isolation, but could be enhanced by indigenous thinking when examining the complex problem that the world is facing right now. So Tyson also talks about the sacred role as custodian of creation, that each of us will find our unique way of contributing to the diversity and sustainability of the complex system they inhabited. This reminds me of the verse in the Holy Quran. It is He who has appointed you as vicegerent or Khalifa in Arabic and has raised some of you in ranks above others that he may try you in what he has given you. Surely your Lord is swift in reckoning, and surely your Lord is forgiving and all compassionate. So this verse embodies three important points. First, human being as vicegerent, as custodian of the creation, or sometimes we call it stewardship, and on earth. And so God entrusted them to many things and endowed them with the power to use them. And second, it is God who has created differences in the ranks among vicegerents, like among the custodians. The trust placed in some is more than the others. And some humans have been granted control of more resources than others, and some are gifted in respect of their abilities. So likewise, some human beings have been placed under the trust of others. But then the third, it is indeed designed to test human. The entire life of human being is a vast examination wherein human is being tested about the trust she or he has received from God, and then how sensitive you actually embody that trust. So today, more than ever, our society is disconnected from natural world, and people need to listen to other wiser than them, and to think differently and to respect the world. It is important when stories like Sand Talk can be told. Like when I was reading the book, this reminds me of the story about the animal lawsuit against humanity. So the origin of the story were Indian, but it was written down the first time on the 10th century in Arabic by a Sufi order called Ikhwanus Safa, Brotherhood of Purity. Then it was translated into Latin by a rabbi for a Christian king, talking about interfaith back then. And the story features a trial in which the inheritors of the animal caused to sue human for unjust treatment and literally box them into a corner. Human physical and intellectual abilities, his religious and metaphysical aspiration, his moral conduct, his rights and obligation vis-a-vis the rest of creation are all bitterly called into question throughout the narrative until the very last part, when humans save the games in extremis by offering the immortality of his soul. The story ends with an appeal to all humans to realize what they need to do and how they need to live. It comes with great force over 1,000 years to us who can see this catastrophe approaching, because humans have, through these 1,000 years, largely ignored this warning. And indeed, things are often so much worse for animals, for plants, and other natural world in current industrialized and human-centered society. And I'm often bothered when I hear the indigenous knowledge or thinking is called wisdom instead of knowledge, but it is knowledge. So lastly, Tantalk convinced me that the most powerful solution to our global problems is to reconnect cultures and natures, especially with our indigenous traditions. And we need to yarn our stories and thought with each other. Thank you.
Thank you. So Tyson, as I said before, we're going to break from the pattern of the last couple of days vis-a-vis these panels. And I'm going to just throw out a few questions to see if they stimulate or stick. But the two of you can also, of course, stick it wherever you wish, but just to name some things that arose and allow some balls to juggle for us. One piece that I heard in your talk was about what linguistic or other keys will open which gates, doors, and hearts. So what is the teaching? What is the action? What is the ritual for a particular place, time, and people to engage in work that feels urgent but challenging? A second piece that I heard was about gender roles, and this has come up more than once, and you've spoken about it briefly, but traditional gender roles, contemporary gender roles, the evolution of our understandings of gender and sexuality. How does that impact the traditions that we've inherited, etc.? And the last, referencing this notion of life as a trial. Does that speak to you? It's not a term that would immediately come to heart and mind for me in framing life's journey cosmologically or theologically. So I'm curious how you hear that, how you understand that, and in which ways it may or may not resonate. I'll slide back now.
Yeah, life is a trial. I try and stay in my lane. So suffering, that's a Russian thing. It's for Russian writers. So so I don't go into the suffering, but I am very interested in ordeals, and I think because of my particular childhood, I became used to ordeals as a way of knowing myself, and I almost, to this day, I don't really feel alive or present unless I've been through a recent ordeal. I need impacts on my body in order to know where my edges are, you know. So for the last year, I've been paying this Geordie fella. Geordies are from the UK. They're they say bastard like that, those ones. And he's a martial artist, but he has his own martial art, and his philosophy is just hit the bastard. Just hit the bastard. Not with that. That's amazingly sacred. It's so profane, and I love it. There must be ordeals. So his answer to everything is just hit the bastard. So it's like, now I'll show you how to defend against a wrist lock. Here, lock my wrist. And I lock his wrist and he punches me in the face. There, just hit the bastard. That's how you defend against that. Here's how you defend against someone grabbing your shirt. Boom, just hit the bastard. So I paid him for a year, just once a week, to just beat the hell out of me in his like private little torture lab. And that's what got me through the last year. When things were getting very, very rough, I found comfort in that ordeal. And part of that is true and good, and part of that is fetishized and pathological. And I'm still struggling to separate which is which, because I derive way too much satisfaction in physical ordeals. There's that part. I think ordeals are, I don't know, for men, we have to impose those things on ourselves. For women, they just have ordeals. Like stepping out the front door is an ordeal. Turning on the television is an ordeal. Engaging with this civilization in any way is an ordeal for a woman. But then biologically, there are ordeals that just keep coming. So you're lucky like that, you get them anyway. For us, we have to do stupid things to get there. I don't have very much wisdom about that. And no wisdom at all, and thank you for calling that out, like this indigenous wisdom idea. I think the the main thing about engaging with Indigenous knowledge as a process is just about the reasoning. There's nothing in what I share with you about my culture that is like, that is helping anything, you know, just in the content, but it's in switching the reasoning. So you've got inductive, you've got deductive, and these have their place. But I think what we're engaging here with in interfaith dialogues is largely abductive reasoning, you know, and I don't like the word because it sounds mean, like abduction. But yeah, we're engaging in abduction, which is a really exciting process because you're applying the concepts and discipline, the reasonings, the tools, the heuristics of one discipline, an unrelated discipline, you're applying that to another one. And amazing things come out, stuff you couldn't possibly have seen, you know, and this is what we get through dialogue. And I think there's nothing particularly special about Indigenous knowledge. I know that people like to frame it as special, but I don't see it as particularly any different to anybody else's knowledge. But it is interesting, as with all knowledge, when it comes to the dialogue with other systems, not just, oh, you have that, but we have that too. That's at the low level. But when you get higher and you're engaging with each other's processes, you're inhabiting that other person's, that sense of the other, and it's super rational. It's like, I don't know about your way, but when you blow that horn, it goes through me, and I'm in there somehow, and I'm seeing something, you know, through those other eyes, and it changes the way I see things. So it makes me think of all those things. And then the sound of Sister's voice here coming through, I'm inhabiting that. There's monkeys, you know, there's tigers, yes, but then there's more. And there we are.
And isn't it like that's what you mean by yarning together, right?
Yeah.
Like we are yarning, like
Yeah.
we kind of like see, kind of like hearing each other, and then also like trying to see it from different, like, you know, system and views.
Like we say, one belly. We're one belly. We're not one mind, we're one belly. And that's that super rational logics of, you know, that feeling thinking.
It's interesting you say like one belly. Yesterday I heard this, because in my cultural tradition, which is like, you know, I mentioned it's matrilineal, we call ourselves coming from one belly. So that's how we call ourselves as matrilineal. So we are connected from the one belly.
Beautiful. Thank you both for departing from the established protocols, having a mini yarn. Nan, I just want to add my thanks in a specific way before calling on David, which is to say that, you know, the root for hospitality and hostility in several different languages is the very same. And so the work of interreligious, intercultural, intergalactic engagement always involves risk. And there are always both the oys and the joys. And we are bound to step in it.
Yeah.
And I think we need to continue to learn from the fullness, the messiness of these engagements. So thank you for sharing that process of thinking about crossing over, crossing back, and how that actually works on the ground in community, including, you know, head, heart, and hands, the healing process of actually planting. David.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here, and I thank Charles and Mahan and particularly Tyson for the opportunity to have this conversation and to be the token Catholic panelist at Notre Dame, which is quite a challenge. And I feel as though I must start by disclaiming comprehension for Catholicism. I am a white working class Catholic from Chicago, not the Chicago you will see. It's not hip or touristy. It's just Chicago. I somehow wandered into the elite secular academy, kind of accidentally as a first generation college student, not really knowing my way around, and ran into a feminist nun at a very secular college who taught me about Father Charles Curran, who was one of the famous dissenting theologians when the Pope issued his encyclical against contraception in 1968. And I was fascinated by the story and decided I wanted to study this moral theology stuff, even though I was at Carleton, which has not produced very many Catholic theologians. And now I teach in the same building that Charlie Curran taught at the Catholic University of America, sponsored by the United States bishops. So that's complicated, in short. And Catholicism, of course, is a complicated tradition. So I want to disclaim any sense of comprehensiveness. I want to start by bringing up Charles Taylor, just as Jacques did, and his idea of a secular age. Charles Taylor is not entirely comfortable with the rise of the secular age in Western cultures, nor am I, and not the political secular order where we're not ruled by religion, but rather what Taylor calls secularity 3, a kind of social imagination of the secular where we're closed off, we're buffered. He uses the term buffered self to talk about the modern secular self going around. And one thing is for sure, Tyson does not live in a closed world, buffered self secularity. His is a world filled with spirits, animated with song lines like about rainbow eels and mad emus, and in which every place has a sacred story swirling around. That is not Taylor's secularity. The dominant Western response to all this, at least for most of the 500 years of the secular age, has been to dismiss it. There are no rainbow eels. Nothing here is worth calling knowledge. And insofar as it does gain any access to that arbiter and guarantor of knowledge, the modern university, it does so via a kind of history of folk waves or literary decoration or wisdom, as you were just discussing. Tyson's project reminds us how wrong this is about what constitutes knowledge. To me, this is the center of his project, contrasting what he calls high context and low context cultures of knowing. He shows how indigenous knowledge insists that everything and everyone is connected. It is thoroughly high context. Knowledge cannot be stored as disconnected bits of information, he says, in which we study each idea as an entity in and of itself. His discussion of the 5 different types of mind, which we haven't heard yet, is characteristic of indigenous thinking, and to me, the heart of the book. And indeed, it does a disservice to summarize it, but I need to at least name these 5 things somehow publicly in the symposium. This knowledge production he explores is 1, always embedded in relationships, both with other people and the land. 2, displayed in narratives, or what he calls song lines, which I think is a more complicated and rich category than our Western category of narrative. 3, involves a communal process of theorizing based on metaphor making that must always be connected to some kind of practice. So that's a very complex little thing going on in the 3rd category. 4th, it requires entrance into deep, if we don't say dreamlike, maybe we can say flow-like. I thought about Csikszentmihalyi's flow-like states of ritual activity that made me as a Catholic think about my best experiences of Catholic liturgy. And then 5th, it involves developing skills at recognizing and honoring complex patterns for solving truly complex problems. This description of high context indigenous knowledge should indict us all, particularly in our current moment when we drown in unprecedented amounts of information, but either as fragmentarily disconnected or as connected only by powerful and invisible algorithms or by powerful and less invisible ideologues. Insofar as the book lives up to its publisher's subtitle, To Save the World, it does so by promoting this different paradigm for how truthful knowledge is produced. Now, low context knowledge causes alarming consequences. And of course, one of these consequences has been the wanton destruction of indigenous peoples, lands, and communities. But in his text, there are two song lines that are highlighted as crises for the whole world community. One is the buildup of massively unsustainable civilizational systems that put an intolerable strain on the whole of creation, of which we should only be custodians. And two is the sort of original sin, and that's Tyson's words, not mine, an original sin that underlies the abandonment of our status as a custodial species, the sin of narcissism. That idiot voice you've heard about inside everyone that whispers, I love this quote, I've already heard it, you are special. You are greater than other people and things. You are more important than everything and everyone. All things and all people exist to serve you. Or as the commercial that I saw at breakfast at the hotel this morning said about a university. It advertised itself as chart your own course. It's all about you, every single message. I call these two crises, narcissism and the unsustainability of our use of environmental resources, the bookends of Yunkaporta's project, because they support the urgency of this central constructive work of changing the way we produce knowledge. From a Christian perspective, these prophetic threats sound comfortingly or uncomfortably familiar. After all, what are the Genesis story or the book of Job or the Psalms, other than, if they're correctly read, tremendous tributes to our custodial status in relation to a reality far greater than us. Francis uses the metaphor not only of our common home, very custodial, but pushes us to see that all creatures exist to give praise to God. And as far as narcissism goes, it sounds like Yunkaporta is saying the basic truth, we are not gods. Francis also says that in Laudato Si. And indeed, in Christianity, our God is revealed most fully as the servant of all, not one who makes creatures simply to serve him. So Tyson describes the aim of yarning as a loose consensus that is inclusive of diverse points of view. And the points above suggest a strong consensus. Everything that I've said, I think, has really strong echoes in Catholicism, at least as I understand it. And in the more substantial paper we've been asked to write, I've loosened that consensus a little bit by raising certain key questions. And here I just want to mention two, and then we can yarn further if we want. I think the most important for the context of this panel is my concern about making something like Western or colonial or even Christian civilization a kind of monolithic and oversimplified other against which indigenous knowledge is described. It's totally understandable why, from an indigenous perspective, one would want to do that, but I do think that there are dangers in doing that. For example, he sticks Plato with the blame for the triumph of low context knowing, and then simply notes that it rippled out from Greece and Macedonia, since it proved useful, this is Tyson's words, proved useful in creating a more obedient workforce and soldiery. People were able to focus solely on the task at hand and did not need to understand the goals of their leaders anymore. I mean, many voices in the Western philosophical tradition would want to dispute that claim that that's the product of Plato. Another example on the first pages of the book, enemy traditions that break down creation systems like a virus are described as the Sumerians started it, the Romans perfected it, and the Anglosphere inherited it. True, kind of,
Yeah.
maybe,
That's
in a way, right? but oversimplified. So, and this shouldn't be an attempt to duck historical honesty or moral responsibility. Sumerians, Romans, and Catholic Christians have plenty to account for. Rather, it's an attempt to recognize the complexity of these traditions and try to name with more precision what exactly has gone wrong, because something deep has gone wrong in those traditions and why it's gone wrong. Now, in the narratives I've learned, including but not limited to Taylor's telling, the key challenge in the Western story happens in the early modern period, in part because of the terrible corruption of the church, but also because of the deeper pervasive human sins of seeking money, sex, and power. The dismal state of Catholic Christianity, I Jock already threw Luther under the bus, so I don't need to do it. The dismal state of Catholic Christianity opened up the desire for a different, rational way of knowing, one that most famously in Descartes rejected any tradition in favor of I think, therefore I am as foundation. And this wrecking ball of systematic doubt from a subjective perspective proved powerful or destructive, as the case may be. As thinkers developed on these foundations, the oversimplifications of modern experimental science, modern nation-state politics, and modern economics, all of which are now enshrined at the highest places of the university world. Now, there's more to all of those things than what I just described, but we should recognize that there are ways in which the narcissism is built in there by a certain kind of definition of practical rationality. And note that this definition of practical rationality differs from pre-modern Western thought. And I go into in the paper, particularly the ways in which Thomas Aquinas, I'm a Catholic, I have to talk about Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas' understanding of the intelligibility of nature is a matter of connecting different components of living creatures. And he even has a wonderful passage where he claims that all creatures, not just human beings, bear traces of the Trinity. And that the reason that God created a diversity of creatures was that God's goodness could not be adequately represented by one creature alone. So the second problem, which I'll mention and won't be a surprise if you heard the introduction about my book, is the problem of trying to describe how to take on our environmental crisis. So the core question of the environment, it seems to me, is not ultimately about literacy, critiques of literacy or critiques of cities, though of course the built environment and the activities it privileges do matter, but about economics. When I mean to ask about how do we address the environmental crisis, I really mean, do we want to blow up the world economy or not? We should get straight on whether we want to or not. I do, in fact, think that the human impact on environmental systems would go way down if we blew up the economy, but a lot of other things would go way down too. Tyson acknowledges this. He says, noting on the upside, apocalypses have proved survivable in the past. Although on the downside, it usually means that your culture and society will never be the same again. But that never be the same again is a little evasive. What it really means is lots of people will suffer and die, and most of the rest will live in impoverished situations of constant conflict. So we could think about alternatives to apocalypse, and most specifically, I've argued at some length that we must come to re-recognize luxury as a vice, a recognition that is well established in Abrahamic faiths, and indeed in almost all faith traditions that I'm aware of. But neglected or even derided by the colonizing generation of modern thinkers, and unfortunately also forgotten by today's global upper middle class. So I do agree in this light with Tyson's claim about the impossible physics of our civilization, but I hope that we might mean other things by civilization than the particular neoliberal order that we've invented in the past 50 years. So in conclusion, I want to commend Tyson's last hand-based image in the book of this 5 ways of knowing. It's a different hand-based image. And the way he describes it is that as he describes these 5 ways of knowing, he says that each metaphor used as an image is connected in pairs and groups to the other images. The information is in each part, but the knowledge lies in the connections between them. This is beautiful, and it seems to me to exemplify the gift of this unusual text that Tyson has written. We are a society awash in disconnected bits of information and deeply lacking in connective knowledge. And so we desperately need to do something a lot about that. And his text constantly pushes us to go beyond our present ideas by allowing indigenous ways of thinking and living to challenge our whole pattern of life. Thank you.
Thank you very much. David will repeat, though it will also be different. The the pattern of the mini yarn. And David articulated two central questions. Tyson, I don't know if you want to pick them up immediately or if you want to wind your way into one or the other.
Can you sum them up?
Sure. So as I heard the latter of the two, which caught my attention, because it was something that I was thinking about and hope to speak to briefly with you, is the nature of change, evolution, revolution, apocalypse. What will happen as we try and make the kinds of changes that you are speaking of, and what will be the consequences of blowing it all up? And are you serious about that? Is this part of a broad thought experiment that then will require more modest implementation?
It's blowing up anyway. You know, it's I don't know. So do we all put our efforts? I mean, I'm supposed to put my back to the wheel to help you save it somehow when it's never been saved before. I read your book, I read your book, I read your book, and I see a lot of places in those books that are desert now, and they weren't freaking desert before, you know? And I see what civilizations do. I see the machine that they are. They are an extractive machine. And I struggle to find a way to separate indigenous and non-indigenous, you know, as a definition. And there's no real meaningful way to do it, except for, you know, if you belong to a tradition, not just a tradition, but a society and a dominant culture, which is maintaining its dominance through the extraction and destruction of the land and the people of the land. Let's just call it that. If you're doing that, then you're not indigenous. You were 5 minutes ago, but you're not at the moment, you know? And that's just a relation between occupiers and occupied, extractor and extractee. Yeah, so that's a thought. Thanks for bringing up the 5 things. I was worried at first because you're Catholic. I thought you might Stephen Covey it. And it'd be like the 5
effective thinking.
Yeah, 5 habits of highly effective natives or something.
That's my hipster pop science.
That's it. Because, and I cringe. I never want to talk about that part because it's like, that's the most self-helpy part of the whole book. And people, I keep getting emails from people saying, I just want to tattoo those things onto my hand. Can I have permission to tattoo you? I'm like, oh my God, don't do anything permanent. Please, God. Yeah. And people keep sending me images of the tattooed these things on them. And I'm like, oh my God, what have you done? You poor thing. Anyway.
Well, we're turning it into a Western form of knowledge. We're like, we can turn it into a Western form of knowledge. And what we need to do is we need to stop and say, and your book's genre, I think, does that, right? Doesn't allow us to do that if we take it.
It's a process. So if you do 5, so the working title in the next book is The Tree That Kills You Back. But the title of it before that was 12 Ways to Avoid Lists in the Anthropocene. Yeah, but yeah, that one, it's a full-on book as we go through we go through Dante's circles of hell. And you mentioned song lines in with regard to wrong things, the narcissism and the extraction. Yeah, in my lab, we've started calling those things wrong lines.
Wrong lines.
So this entire book is about wrong lines, and every object that I made for this next book, I've had to burn it afterwards because it's been just a poison thing. So the next book gets really dark, but then the third, because I think it'll be a trilogy, will come out. Now, where's Uncle gone? Uncle Tim, he's gone now. He was there a minute ago. Anyway, I just wrap up because you're talking about Trinity and the threes, and he was asserting from his point of view as a physicist that there's never an us two, there's never a pair, there's always a third, and that in physics and in creation, that's one of the patterns. There is always 3, which I think was really cool. I thought of that with something I said in there. Did I cover the other question as well? Because there's time.
There is.
It's a factor.
Let me ask it in the following way. David, tell me if this dovetails enough. But I'm very curious, in David's critique of bifurcation or dichotomization between forms of knowledge, I think the word wisdom still has a lot to offer us, particularly as a person that hears that word and translates it back into the word chokhmah in Hebrew. But in any case, we'll come back to that. But how might you translate something that you have learned on this trip from these yarns when you return to your country, to your community, to your home, that is in the give and take, in the reciprocity? How might you bring together worlds of knowledge in new and different ways? I'm also thinking again about crossing over and crossing back. Paul Knitter, among others in the interreligious sphere, talks about the significance of serving both as host and guest. And you clearly have a gift for translation. And so I'm curious, upon return, what it might be.
The main thing I've learned is that wisdom, what we're calling wisdom now, I've always believed that to be something that's acquired through ordeal and that requires ordeal. It's a way of marking that passage. But I think I've learned that it can be sublime too. It can be acquired through, very good hospitality and service to one another in quite sublime, peaceful, soothing, healing connection. You can acquire wisdom that way. I've never experienced that before, so until this trip. So I have to think about that. I also need to think about language from my time with the Native Americans here and Native Canadians, and being gifted of a wind instrument as well from here, and several braids of sweetgrass and various other things, but a lot of teachings. And one of those is about language. So we see language as part of the land in Australia, and it just comes out of the land. But it's different here. There's this idea that it's an entity. It's a sentient entity in a self-organizing system in and of itself. And that if you're learning a language or teaching a language, you have to do ceremony for the spirit of that language. And that you're engaging with a living being when you're engaging with the language. Anyway, that's a tangent, but I've been struck with a overwhelming desire to learn Arabic since I started this trip, and I've been thinking about all the ways I'd like to do that. And then I thought about what if I came to it with that Native American, Native Canadian kind of Turtle Island approach? How would I learn Arabic, engaging in appropriate ritual and ceremony to come into dialogue with Arabic as a living entity? Anyway, they're my two big takeaways, I guess.
Thank you. So before I share, I just want to invite the two other speakers, while I am presenting, to think about other questions that you might want to ask. If I inadvertently skipped over something that was important to you, or that has emerged in the course of our mini yarns thus far. So your book, Tyson, arrived via Amazon. I'm somewhat embarrassed to say, given the nature of our conversations, in mid-July. And that dovetailed with the beginnings of my preparations for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, for the Jewish high holiday season. And I want to thank you, because among the gifts that you gave me was the opportunity to think anew, to think afresh about those preparations in several ways. One specifically centered around story mind, as you describe it. Narrative is the most powerful mechanism for memory. While isolated facts go only to short-term memory or to mid-term memory with repetition, story goes immediately to long-term memory. In reading those words, in meditating on your drawings and carvings, I was drawn back to this ritual object and the stories that it holds, the echoes of those stories that are sounded every time I purse my lips and invest my breath in trying to bring forth the ancient notes from the shofar. The word shofar itself is a complicated one. So we think that it has Assyrian roots and that it refers to a specific species of goat from the ancient Near East. And then in Hebrew, that is the Hebrew of the Bible, it seems to be related to the word tzafir, meaning a male goat specifically. Then in Rabbinic Hebrew, it is associated with the word lishaper, which means to repair or to beautify. All of those are present, even in the etymology of this ancient and mysterious word and the object that is the embodiment of those words. The shofar has been used variously over the centuries, even in the Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible. It's used in times of threat, it's used in times of joy, and it's also used in times of more intimate friendship. So all of those and more are encoded in this instrument. One of the reasons why your work and my renewed engagement with the shofar were so powerful, as I said over the weekend to you in a smaller group setting, is that on the one hand, this is one of the oldest, quote unquote, indigenous instruments that has survived throughout the ages. And when we were exiled centuries ago, we were able to take it with us. And that in part is the secret of the survival of Jews and Judaism, which is to say, what could we take with us? And how could we create home in different places, in different times, using a blend of the old and the new? One of the ways to come back to story mind is that we found home and find home in stories, in narrative. Here is one example. When the great Rabbi Yisrael Baal Shem Tov saw misfortune threatening the Jews, it was his custom to go into a certain part of the forest to meditate. There he would light the fire, say a special prayer, and the miracle would be accomplished and the misfortune averted. Years later, when a disciple of the Baal Shem Tov, the celebrated Maggid of Mezrich, had occasion for the same reason to intercede with heaven, he would go to the same place in the forest and say, Master of the universe, listen, I don't know how to light the fire, but I'm still able to say the prayer. And again, the miracle would be accomplished. Still later, another Rabbi, Moshe Leib of Sasov, in order to save his people once more, would go into the forest and say, I don't know how to light the fire. I don't know the prayer, but I do know the place. And this must be sufficient. One more generation. Rabbi Israel of Regine, faced with great misfortune, is now sitting not in the forest, but in his armchair. His head in his hands, he speaks to God and says, I can't light the fire. I don't know the prayer. I don't know the place. All I can do is tell the story. And this must be sufficient. And as you said so beautifully in our interaction, story is one way to find home.
Carry it to you.
A brief teaching that I want to share with you in the same vein. Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev, one of the great Hasidic masters who died in 1809, teaches the following. And it's my attempt to weave together some of the themes that have been discussed over the course of the last few days. The Rebbe from Berdichev looks at the very first word of the Hebrew Bible, Bereshit, in the beginning. And he says it actually can be read not simply as in the beginning, but it can be read as two beginnings. Whenever there is a beginning, there are at least two beginnings. Bet is the second letter in the Hebrew alphabet. Reshit means beginning. The Holy Blessed One bestows bounty upon us, and we, through our prayers, limit and shape this bounty, each of us according to our will. Everything spiritual has a physical counterpart. Sound and speech, for example, exists in the corporeal realm. The sound of the shofar on Rosh Hashanah is the bounty of the blessed Creator. It is undifferentiated, unparsed. The prayers we say on this holiday shape the bounty, each according to our will. The all-inclusive bounty that emerges from the blessed Creator is the written Torah. And the various forms we give it are the oral Torah. For oral Torah is fashioned according to our interpretations of the written Torah. This is the meaning of Bereshit. Bet Reshit, two beginnings. Let me try and tease this apart in a few sentences. My act of translation. In the beginning, according to the Jewish mystical tradition, the divine doesn't create from a distance, but it is through a process of emanation. Breath, water, light are the metaphors of that creative process. Chiyut, or vitality, is all inclusive. And then each of us has the opportunity to give shape and form to that vitality. One way of coming to understand that, say our sages, is to listen very carefully to the sound of the shofar. As the breath comes through unparsed and particular words and phrases, and then to make a decision, particularly over the course of these days of awe, about what kind of lives we want and need to live. So our prayers and then our actions are our response to the shofar, to the breath. Then says this master, since he's commenting on the very first word in the Hebrew Bible, the same is true of Torah. It is pattern thinking. In the beginning, God gives life to all. It is that breath. It is that light. It is that water. It is wisdom, chokhmah. It is what you might call the primordial Torah, long before it is ever written down on a scroll or in a book. And then it is our task to interpret it. And then we write it down, and then others interpret it. And then they write it down, and others interpret it, and so forth and so on. And that is the process of living in story, living in ritual, living in the natural world, which itself, of course, is supposed to be Torah writ large. because that divine wisdom permeates all that is. Melo chol haaretz kvodo. God's glory fills the whole earth. One other story. You say in your book that we need to exchange stories. And I agree with that. And in this case, I want to say something that might be surprising given the reverence with which I just spoke about this master and this mystical teaching. Part of the complicated process, I think, of being both an inheritor and an innovator, living inside of the myths and the metaphors and the traditions that have been bequeathed to us, and also being critical of them, is the question of tradition and innovation, of continuity and discontinuity. The master that I just cited, who is a rebbe to me, who is a master to me, lived in the 18th century, and he was renowned for his love of everyone in his community. But given the circumstances in which he lived in the Pale of Settlement, given the ways in which Jews were beaten down over centuries, given the cosmology that he inherited from previous generations, he also articulated very nasty things about non-Jews, oftentimes encoded in sermons like this, so that it would be less likely that he would be the victim of punishment by those that had greater power. So what do we do with the mixed legacies that we have all inherited? The good, the bad, and the ugly. We need to be self-critical. And so one example of that is from a teacher that Dr. Seuss and I share in common, the late Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalom, who was a kind of freewheeling, countercultural Hasidic rabbi. And he tells a story of being in Calgary, Canada, at a symposium on mysticism, where all of the people that were invited are placed in a modern plastic hotel. And he says, "Feh." He's not going to leave, of course. So it is Elul, the month before Rosh Hashanah. He has his talit, his prayer shawl, his tefillin, and his shofar. And so he finds his way to the rooftop. And there he looks west to the Canadian Rockies, and then turns east and begins to pray. And lo and behold, another person emerges out of the kind of maze of pipes and so forth. And it is Brother Rufus Goodstrike, a healer, a medicine man, and he brings with him his instruments for prayer. They don't engage in the same prayer service. Each finds his own space, but then they engage in a process of comparison and contrast in an appreciative mode. It's not a theological disputation, but an opportunity to say, how do you use this bone whistle? How do you use this prayer shawl? What is the purpose of these tassels? And so I bring that as an example of what can happen, Jacques, I think, when there is the possibility of a third space. Call it secular, call it religious, but a third space in which people from different religious or spiritual traditions have the freedom to meet and to engage and to share what is common and to learn how to disagree in more agreeable ways. So I want to thank you, because in my process of preparation for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, in conversation with your work, which is similar and different, I was given the opportunity to reinvest in the symbols, the traditions, the teachings of Judaism that are so powerful, but that in some ways I took for granted, which is part of the gift of the outsider coming and saying, take a look. Is this resonant? Is it difficult? Does it agitate? Does it inspire? And lo and behold, here I am between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, sounding the shofar with all of you. So thank you.
There's so much power in
Other questions, comments? 12 minutes. Shall we call on folks, or do you too have something in store? Yeah.
I just wanted him to explain his movement, that it's davening. That's what he's doing. Could you just tell?
Yeah, I wasn't actually aware of it, but there is a kind of rhythmic swaying that I've inherited and engage in whenever I'm doing anything with focus that that an embodied mimemic way feels that it partakes of the sacred.
Can I say something to that briefly? I've seen the exact same motion with imams and traditional scholars within the Islamic tradition.
I missed that. I was like, I was in ceremony day, you know. So I didn't see you swaying.
Questions, comments, thoughts, generative disagreements.
Thank you, you changed my life. Say that alone. I just said, thank you, you've changed my life.
How so?
You opened up my mind. You made me realize that change is necessary. But it's got to be graceful. It's got to be supportive. I've got a lot of work to do.
Tyson, I wanted to just say that in your book, I was so thankful when I arrived at chapter 11 or 12 about lemonade.
Yeah.
Because I was becoming impatient with your advocacy and your polemical advocacy.
Yeah.
And then I said, thank God, bless her, that she endowed him with the wisdom to also be self-critical.
Yeah.
Because I think it is just absolutely crucial to all of us. And each of our traditions speaks of humility. And then we have so little of it historically when it comes to our engagement with other peoples and traditions. And Suzanne and a few others of us were speaking about theological worldviews and the necessity to truly open ourselves to learning from other people. And that requires a certain kind of epistemological humility. That I think goes hand in hand with saying Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev was a master, is a master. Did you see what he did with one word from the Torah? The ways in which he wove together so beautifully shofar, Torah, divinity, and at the same time, like every other human being, his world was sharply divided given the circumstances between Yidden, Jews, and Goyim, the rest of you.
Yeah, I think I was not chosen for a reason. I think we've had the same experience, you and I. I just want to caution you that when you're in this state, you're quite vulnerable for a couple of days to disinformation. And Are you quite susceptible to being drawn into some kind of cult or something like that? It's yeah, when you feel that state of being touched and come through ceremony and you feel, and you're walking in that afterwards, you're vulnerable to people who will take advantage of you. So be careful for that.
All checks can be made out to.
Okay, so this has been so enriching for me for the past couple of days and even the day before. And I think what we all had in common, which was so beautiful, is that we're going to the essences. We're going back to the values, we're going back to the human essence of all of us. And that's why we're talking about the indigenous. So I think we're losing this spontaneity today when it comes to power and interests. And the big question is how to translate all of this into our lives and make a bigger impact on the larger picture. We have so much in common, and yesterday we had also a musical dialogue about human suffering, basically, of mothers from different cultures, especially in the East, in the Oriental traditions. And we were saying that if the mothers were entitled, they wouldn't allow wars, because you've spent so much time raising these kids and caring for these sons. So what the mothers would do, what women are doing basically, is to gather and embrace all these people, all these encounters. So how do we all embrace these beautiful values, these beautiful people, and have the human being at the center, and translate our humanity into everything that we just discussed in the past 3 days, which has been really enriching and beautiful and so genuine. But how do we take this into practice? We're always asked as practitioners of interfaith dialogue. This is a myth. You always bring together all these religious leaders and then nothing happens. And when I go to the grassroots, I agree with them in several points, but how do we translate this that we shared so generously in the past days about how to be humble, how to be loving, how to go back to these roots, how to be in touch with the earth and talk about the importance of everything going on today ecologically? How do we spread such love and such wisdom, whether we call it wisdom or knowledge, but how to benefit from that and walk the talk, basically? Thank you.
That's something I really wanted to say before, just to, explain more about this civilization thing I've got. So you can't become an extractive culture or an extractive economy until you separate from the mother, until not just separate, but become hostile to the mother. That has to become part of your culture and run through every part of it, because the land obviously is the mother, and you can't extract from her until that's what you think of mothers. And every part of your everything you do, even in this profound situation here, I'm intensely aware that the mother of my children is not able to be in the room, and she must be out where the children are, because we can't do this very serious and important business if there's kids running around, and if there are mothers, lactating and doing biological things around here. In the secular world, we've got to be up, yeah. I think with everything, if we can re-anchor back into the mother and child as the center of your culture and your economy, the way your buildings are designed, the way your events are designed, your worship, your everything else. That might be a way. I think if you try and stop extraction directly, no more extraction, that's not going to work, because then you're setting fire to everything. But I don't think it's setting fire to anything to try and subtly redesign things so that mothers are welcome, mothers are centered, mothers are honored and important. That might be a good thought.
That's interesting, because when I'm talking about the earth, environment, natural things with my Muslim communities, I actually remind them there's this hadith about when the Prophet said that, beware of the earth, because this is your mother, your mother. But then also there's another saying from the prophet that you respect your mother 3 times. Your mother, your mother, your mother, then your father. So if we have that respect to our own mother that much, how about this Mother Earth? And usually when I mention that, people just jaw drops because they never connect these two things in, you know, like in that way, and how we see this earth as our mother, like you said. Like, you know, are we going to extract and then destroy and, you know, like make our mother suffer?
That's it.
And there are, I will just say, there are a lot of traditionalist Catholics out there that if you went out and said, we need to build a child centered on the mother, need to build a society centered on the mother and the child, they would be like, bring it on. Oh, they don't know necessarily what it is. You'd have to argue about what that is, but they would be responsive to that because they have a sense that the modern culture is hostile to that enterprise.
I'll just add that I have a brother that lives in Jerusalem who's gay. His partner is called Abba by his twin children, a girl and a boy. And he is called Amma, which is not Abba, but is also not Ima. And this is a term that they came upon. So as we're thinking again about gender roles, traditional and contemporary, I just want to say that in a city where it is not simple to be a gay family with children adopted by a surrogate from India, because gay men cannot yet do that easily in Israel and in many other countries, it's fascinating to me to think about Abba and Amma, the old and the new.
May I add something that that is inspired by your deliberations, all of you, and that's something that I discussed with Renee. If you look at the Arabic language, thank you for reminding us of the Hadith. There are 2 words or roots of words. One is which is mother, but it is also the same root from which the word imam, the imam of a congregation, of a community. So a religious leader is technically the mother of that group. So it's not only the female mother, but also the role of nurture and caretaking that is expected of a religious leader. And that's why the argument about why is it always a man who can be an imam, right? So just an interesting point there in terms of language. And another point that Renee reminded me of, and I asked her permission to share, has to do with where the womb, rahim, and the rahmah, which is mercy.
Rachamim.
Exactly. And where there is a connection between earth as the womb from which we emerge and have to continue to honor. So the language itself has so much in it that brings us back to the root of where we need to be merciful, and where indeed we owe that respect to the earth and its inhabitants as we lead them, including religiously. Thank you.
Renee, I just want to offer a closing plea, which is for us to continue to deliberate about how it wants to share with each other and with one another what we love, what we cherish about our respective traditions, and what we find difficult and challenging. And oftentimes, I feel like artists, poets, musicians are able to occupy those liminal spaces in ways that others of us are frightened of and such. So I think that there's an important connection there liminality, ambiguity, risk-taking, uncertainty, love and devotion, but also earnest questioning and pained, challenging.
And if I may just add to that, what Renee was mentioning, Rabbi, I saw your notes like the head, the heart, and the hands. I also use that as the 3H of this thing that we as human, we have our hearts, our head, and our hands. We cannot just touch one, but we have to, like, like interchangeable, use all of them. That's how we can like weave in, like yarn our conversations. We use this 3H in our bodies and our soul.
Thank you all for joining us for this symposium. For this particular panel, please give them a round of applause.